Hello everyone and welcome to this our week 4 lecture for peace studies. I am very sorry that this is late. I have to admit this whole technical thing is really starting to get on my nerves a little bit, and I want to apologize for not having this done earlier today. I was able to get my morning class done, not that that's any consolation to you guys, but then apparently my software decided to not allow me to record my face on the slide as we were doing before, and I don't know if that's even something you guys like, but I have literally spent 2 hours today, perhaps stupidly, trying to get that addressed, and I have posted to the producers of the software and everything. I have no understanding at all of why this is not possible, but every time I try to put the internal camera back on now, it crashes on me. So, for now anyway, until I get that sorted, we're just going to have the audio and the video of the slide here. And, well, I hope you've enjoyed the readings for this week. What we're going to do this week is reserve the conclusion of our Gurevich piece. I already did comment on that in last week's lecture a little bit and some of the key concepts that were coming up in the books, for me anyway, so far. I want to finish talking about the book with you when we meet on Thursday. Wednesday. And then I want to focus today on just talking about a contrast between the reading last week, one of the readings we didn't cover from last week was the Michael Howard piece, and a piece that was from this week's reading, which is by William James. And I just loved the little contrast between the two pieces, so I thought I would focus in on that and then make that the subject of this lecture for the first part of the week, and then we can look at the rest of the readings when we meet on again on Wednesday. So, moving forward, just to look a little bit about Michael Howard, I think for those of you who've taken my international relations class before, it's very obvious, I think, that Howard is a realist. And the question, I think, that emerges is which kind. If you've taken my international relations theory class with me before, you know that one of the key tensions in realism is between what we can call classical realism and neo-realism. Now, if you haven't taken my international relations class before, don't worry, I'll explain those two terms very briefly. Classical realism is a theory that goes back, it's time old, it's timeless rather. The sort of premise of the theory is that human nature is essentially pretty malicious and ugly as a phenomena, and that people left to their own devices, despite the fact that they might think that they're acting in the interests of some sort of superior cause, for example, a religion or a philosophy, actually that they're selfish and self-interested, and they're subject to vanity and lust and various other types of passions and psychological conditions and ailments, which effectively compel them constantly to be looking to maximize their self-interest. Later on, you find in sort of philosophical development theories which try to sort of express that reading of human nature in terms of a political theory. So, for example, with the birth of modern political theory, we have Hobbes, who suggests, again, based on this idea of a sort of an untoward human nature, that human beings ultimately have a fairly dim life, a poor condition of life under conditions of anarchy. And this is in fact a common theme which runs throughout political theory, but Hobbes expressed it particularly well, because he expressed it firstly in terms of the need for a social contract, which few had, if any, had done before. And what Hobbes's argument was that basically the reason why the nation state exists is to put men out of their misery and suspend the condition of anarchy, thereby allowing for sort of forward momentum and progress. But of course that just works within the confines of the nation state. Outside the confines of the nation state, you have the international realm, and the international realm does not have a government and does not have itself a sort of a sovereign force or a police force, judiciary, etc. The institutions which we sort of identify as being key to domestic political life. Without these things present in the international sphere, the nation states of the earth are condemned to always be stuck in this kind of dog-eat-dog, law of the jungle type scenario where nobody trusts anyone, and cooperation where it exists is usually based on short-term needs, compelled, for example, by the emergence of a large power which has to be balanced or held in check lest all the other small powers die. And so this leads us to a sort of a basic set of principles that we can sort of ascribe to realism. We call them the 3 S's: statism, statism, survival, and self-help. Statism, of course, being the tendency of human beings to come together in states, thereby to provide security domestically. But then, of course, once those states are constituted, they act kind of as corporate bodies. They act as one. Even though they might contain a multitude within them, they are, for all intents and purposes, externally speaking, functionally equivalent. They act as one. And so this allows us to start speaking about a motivation of that state having a motivation which we call the will to survive. And how do they pursue survival within the realm of anarchy? That's their dominant condition. They pursue survival through the means of self-help. And self-help, of course, is this idea that nation states have to sort of help themselves because no one else will help them. Now, realism diverges on this point of how best to theorize the embrace of self-help. Is self-help driven ultimately by the selfishness of human interest, the selfish of the collective interests of the people of that state, their vanity, their lust for glory, or perhaps a lustful king or dictator might be the source of this sort of aggressive behavior. But either way, for a classical realist, it's more to do with human nature. Nation states act avariciously, they lust for power, because that is the human condition. From a neo-realist perspective, this sort of idea of reducing it all to human nature seems a little unscientific. And I think Michael Howard falls into this category. He is, as we read in the piece, quite open to there's a couple of different points where he mentions the possibility of psychological sort of conditions which could be pushing nation states to act. There are also points where he talks about superstitions and religious types of missions, and that's all very well and good, but he is specifically, I think, trying to focus in, we might call him an unwilling realist, or an unwilling neo-realist. I think for the simple reason that he's compelled to offer his theory not so much as a sort of an eager theorization of how the world works, but because he is critical of a sort of naivete that he perceives on the part of liberals and elite theorists. Elite theorists, of course, being sort of synonymous with Marxist theory. They often would sort of theorize war by looking at how elites and dominant interests within the nation state could be sort of co-opting the state's military power to drive it to go to war. And that's something he seems to disagree with. Of course, that might be happening, he suggests, but if you look at Clausewitz, for example, the way he cites Clausewitz or Hobbes in the piece, it's very clear that he thinks that the nation state and the fact of nation state warfare, that nation states exist and go to war, means that the type of conflict that they engage in is not just any old type of conflict. Surely those sorts of conflicts might happen, but in the modern era, with the modern nation state existing, it seems that he is eager to sort of look at the sort of conscious decision, the bureaucratic conscious, if you will, structural decision of the state to go to war. That's not something that just happens on the whim of an elite group. That is a concerted, premeditated, calculated decision, and what he's interested in is how those decisions take place and what compels them. And so to draw this out, he makes a contrast. I think you've probably read this in here. He draws a contrast between the general control, or the central control that contemporary war has, and this is something that he sort of sees in favor of contemporary warfare, that it has a for better or for worse, it is controlled. There's an apparatus, there's an administration, there's a bureaucracy called the military, and it has a relationship with government, and all of these things are coordinated and calculated. He contrasts this with the medieval view, for example, which would have sent men off to war on a whim, perhaps for glory or for other purposes. One of the things I really wanted to draw your attention to with this article is the idea of the reliance on a kind of an external pressure on the state. And I think this is the thing that really sort of triggers, in my mind anyway, the neo-realist heritage of the piece, its neo-realist credentials, so to speak. The point becomes, I think, very apparent when he cites Raymond Aron on page 40 on the second column, where he essentially alludes to international relations as being kind of a zero-sum game. And it's key language here. The whole thing is worth, the whole sort of paragraph is worth reading out loud. He says, and here perhaps we do find a factor that sets interstate conflict somewhat apart from other forms of social rivalry. States may fight, indeed as often as not they do fight, not over any specific issues such as might otherwise have been resolved by a peaceful means. In other words, there's no single thing or substantive issue that's really, at the end of the day, causing them to go to war. But in order to acquire, to enhance, or to preserve their capacity to function as independent actors in the international system at all, the stakes of war, as Raymond Aron has reminded us, are the existence, the creation, or the elimination of states. It is a somber analysis, but one which the historical record very amply bears out. So what does it mean to sort of resort to this in the final instance, having talked about the various things that he's talked about as causes of war, and admitted that these other causes definitely have a role to play? But it seems that at the end of the day, states are very conscious about their survival, and that is a realist contention, all right. But with such a focus on anarchy, with such a focus on this idea of needing to sort of preemptively maintain the military in a state of readiness, such that you can ward off a potential threat, or alternatively to increase your allocation of power within the overall zero-sum game of international relations to maximize your security, does very much seem like a neo-realist contention. It's a system-level theory, if you recall from international relations class. So what else do we want to say about Howard? Another main sort of quote here is the quote that comes through about neorealism when he sort of basically replaces or suggests that we can basically replace the language of the Peloponnesian War cited by Thucydides with the language of World War I, and talk about how these wars are basically interchangeable phenomena, that they basically follow the same basic model of interstate rivalry that all wars have fought. So World War I, he concludes, was about states and peoples wanting to maintain power, and in this idea, this comparison with the time of Thucydides, we get the distinctive impression of a vicious circle. But while that's true for him, and he does sort of look at this sort of constant that has driven international relations and conflict throughout the generations, he does seem to be suggesting that the nature of threat, the nature of what nation states perceive to be threatening them, has changed. And that's very interesting. As he says on page 41, something has changed since the time of Thucydides. However, something that has changed since the time of Thucydides, however, is the nature of the power that appears so threatening. The nature of the power that appears so threatening. What is it you're being confronted with? It was once upon a time that you were confronted with maybe an army of some sort, but now you're being confronted with literally the power of an entire nation. So what seems to have emerged in the 17th century, he argues, and this comes through very, very clearly, is the birth of the modern army, which changes what states want. They now need to defend themselves not just from an invading army, but a modern army, which is not which is a phenomena that approaches you and confronts you with the entire combined potential of a modern industrial nation state. So power ceased then to be about territory, which was considered to be the basic equivalent of power, or the way you would measure power in the past. Your geographical dominion was the way you would measure power. And it started to become about effectiveness, your ability to apply technology and production techniques and also state planning to make sure your population was disciplined, strong, fit, able, and project manpower and use your logistical prowess and industrial might to express your mastery on the battlefield. So with new technology then, power becomes about the number of men and also becomes about your logistical capacity. And he uses the term nation at arms to give over to the idea of what this actually is. So I think one thing that's really clear in the piece is where he, at this juncture, where he talks about the emergence of the nation at arms and the idea subsequently of the idea of what he calls competing technologies, that this is on page 42, where he begins to introduce the concept and his discussion of the arms race. And again, it's just really fascinating that he is making the same point over and over again in a way that at root, while many liberals are people who sort of may decry war, these elite theorists and the Kantians maybe that we were discussing earlier on. And by the way, when I said Kantians earlier on, I might not have qualified what I meant. I'm conscious of that and I apologize. But obviously we're talking about people who might be appreciators of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who was I think one of the first ever elite theorists who would have suggested that wars were caused by dictators and kings who had no accountability to the people. And I think Howard would have extreme issues with that, although Kant obviously is someone who was very influential on the movement of the peace movement that led to the establishment of the League of Nations and subsequently the United Nations. People like Woodrow Wilson would have taken him very, very seriously, even though, of course, they were decades and decades apart in terms of when they lived. But to come back to my point, the idea here being that there are. It's not necessarily that elites might be leading us to war, or similarly the idea of contemporary peace lovers who decry the cruelty of the arms race. He's suggesting on page 42 that it's not at all clear that arms races themselves cause war. In fact, if anything, he says at the bottom, they can be no more isolated than wars themselves from political circumstances that give rise to them. Further up the page, he's suggesting that to suggest that they in themselves are causes of war implies a naive, if not totally mistaken, view of the relationship between the two phenomena. The causes of war remain rooted as much as they were in the pre-industrial age in perceptions by statesmen of the growth of hostile power and the fears for the restriction, if not extinction, of their own. The threat, or rather the fear, has not changed, whether it comes from the aggregations of territory or from the dreadnoughts, from the number of men under arms or from missile systems. The means that states employ to sustain or extend their power may have been transformed, but their objectives and preoccupations remain the same. So this is what you might say new wine in old bottles. The core realist principles remain true, but the nature of the threat of what states are sort of throwing at each other, if you will, has changed. And I wanted to offer you just a little video clip here, which you can look at yourselves. I'll put a link to that on our Blackboard page that you guys can click, or you can just copy it down here. It's just an opportunity for you to see the man talk and engage in discussion. So one final sort of idea that comes up here is this question of the emergence of a sort of a sociological change that Thucydides, that Michael Howard is interested in. That, you know, what we're seeing here is, in the Western world at least, is the emergence of a category of people who are, if you will, peace lovers. And he wants to know if that sociological change is just a Western phenomena. On page 43, he says, the question that arises today is how widely and evenly is that intense revulsion against war that at present characterizes our own society. For if war is indeed now universally seen as being unacceptable as an instrument of policy, then all analogies drawn from the past are misleading, and although power struggles may continue, they will be diverted into other channels. So he's basically asking here is whether we have the emergence of a genuinely different type of society today because of the popular emergence of the anti-war protesters and this kind of thing that would be sort of contemporary to the Vietnam War. But in fact, of course, the Quakers were protesting World War II, and the tradition of a political anti-war movement goes back quite far. But I guess he's partially correct, because since World War I anyway, when people saw the sheer horror and carnage that industrial war between two nation states, full tilt industrial war, a total war between those industrial states, could the damage that could be done to human lives and culture would just be so enormous. So one of his concluding points is whether or not this sociological change is significant. And of course what he's suggesting is that it may not be that significant, because of course we all know that there's parts of the world where this kind of Western style evolution has not really sort of taken root yet. And so what would be the point in us becoming pacifists when other people are not likely to be part of that at all, to agree with those ends? But leaving Howard behind now and moving on to William James, there's a nice transition. I don't know if you if this struck you at all, or whether you might think I'm incorrect in perceiving this, but it seemed to me that this question of a sort of a sociological change in the Western mentality that Howard is sort of cautiously sort of warning against embracing is actually something that William James was perceiving way back even before World War I. And William James is asking us to take seriously the fact that this sociological transformation is taking place in the West. Howard obviously is cynical about it and doesn't believe that it's actually happening. But I thought for a minute we might just sort of juxtapose the two readings and just think about how they relate to each other. So what William James seems to be saying is that what Howard, maybe as a conservative war theorist, can't say is that wars today clearly are becoming too expensive, and this is something that James was saying even before World War I. So I mean, obviously, whatever was going to happen, after World War, I mean, you can only imagine what he would have thought. But William James is someone who believes that, obviously just wars are wrong and incorrect phenomena, that they are not at all indicative of the best that human beings can be. They are driven by false ideologies of heroism. Just look at, and this is something that's been the case throughout human history. Just look at look at our heroes. Look at what the Greeks, who the Greeks had for heroes. They, as he observes, I think with a sort of a couple of quipping remarks, that what the Greeks had for heroes were basically murderers, and so too, we can look around in our society and see that we have often got some very choice heroes and role models to which we look and imagine we might someday be just like them when we grow up. William James is not sanguine about our cultural sort of capacity for peace in that sense. This has been going on a long time, and it seems he's suggesting that it will go on for a long enough time to come. Yet, while he is a pacifist, William James is an interesting story here because as someone who's altogether capable of looking at the kind of unnecessary and squalid nature of American wars, he uses this term squalid to describe the 1898 war, and he notes how it was popular cultural dynamics that pulled McKinley into the Philippines. These wars obviously were to a certain extent wars of popular jingoism, and the pacifist in James is appalled by these wars and the fact that these such wars can exist. But just to remember Howard's question about whether we're living in an age where there's been a broader sociological transformation, have a look at this language that James is using, because while he is a pacifist, he's deeply aware of what some of the conservatives of his time were suggesting was going on in the society of which he was a part. He saw the emergence of an industrial base that was leading to increased wealth on the part of many. Now he was a socialist, and he understood full well that true wealth was not being circulated throughout the economy. But he was aware of the emergence of what he calls the pleasure economy, which is an economy, you might say, of distractions, where luxury goods and various other things like media products are becoming available to people, which distract them, I think, from the hardships of life, and also maybe give them a false sense of comfort, distract them from the real issues. And so there's a sense that James is, in this regards, an early cultural conservative, that he's kind of anxious about the kind of spectacular social revolution that's going on around him, as people maybe forget about the duties of citizenship in favor of these distractions. Today, of course, you know the story. We have people who are worried about all we do is play Xbox and watch television and think about ourselves. We're individuals first, selfish individuals, satisfying our own individual needs first with Britney Spears CDs, etc. And we've lost the true measure of life because we don't know pain. So we pursue these false pleasures, but not knowing pain, of course, you don't know the value of things, right? And this is the classic conservative approach to the modern economy. It's not so much that conservatives can be opposed to the market too. If you go back to Burke, if you remember from our political theory class, Burke was opposed to the market because he felt that the market had no moral compass to it. Not that he was capitalist in the sense that a Marxist would be, but rather because he believed that the masses would have no moral moorings. They wouldn't know what way was right and what way was wrong. So James here is sort of repeating this idea, this sympathy here, while he is a pacifist, a sympathy with those who understand that the so-called pleasure economy is eroding moral values. And so James believes that the reply of the pacifists to this is too weak. On page 69, he is suggesting that the pacifists who simply believe that the only response to war is this idea of its vileness and its shamefulness, as he says on page 69. That's a weak argument, because there is something to be said, he seems to be suggesting, for this idea that war is sadly perhaps one of these things. It just happens to be one of these things that can really bring people together and give them a greater sense of purpose, fighting for something bigger than themselves. And he does sort of share this concern that the conservatives have, that modern values have no sense of this need to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves. They have no attachment to the whole. They are just solely individualistic in their nature. Conversely, though, the pacifist in him comes through very clearly, I think, when he suggests that there are many who would celebrate military culture uncritically, and that too you can find on page 69, where right in the middle of the second column he says, no collectivity is like an army. No collectivity is like an army for nourishing such pride, but it has to be confessed that the only sentiment which the image of Pacific cosmopolitan industrialism is capable of rousing in countless worthy breasts is shame at the idea of belonging to such a collectivity. Where is the sharpness and precipitousness, the contempt for life, whether one's own or another's? Where is the savage yes and no, the unconditional duty? Where is the conscription? Where is the blood tax? Where is anything that one feels honored by belonging to? So what is he saying exactly here? This idea of the shame quote is there, I think, because he wants to, having just said that the pacifists are, in a way, too weak in their analysis of the situation because they don't want to face up to the reality that modern society does need some sort of military spirit, if you will. And I guess we'll nuance this as we discuss later, the concluding part of the article. But this idea that the military is great, but it needs critique, I think, is the point that he's bringing through here. The pacifists lose the battle. They're right, but they lose the battle because they sound like they don't understand that the society today does need a kind of an esprit de corps, as the French would say, a military spirit. And it is languishing for want of that military spirit. And this, of course, coming from a man who's a socialist, I guess there's a element of Rousseau that's coming through here, as Rousseau classically thought that there needed to be a sort of an engagement with the public sentiment, with the popular imagination, in order to maintain social unity and maintain commonality of purpose. But against those who would say that the military itself was the answer to this, he seems to have very strong criticism. And of course that's very apparent in the quote that we've just read, because he's saying while the army is great for nourishing pride, those who are going to sing about it should realize that in the contemporary Pacific cosmopolitan industrialism. Now, what is that, right? That's a really, really important point, which speaks to the author's sense, I think, just like Howard, that there's been something like a sociological transformation. Pacific cosmopolitan industrialism on page 69 refers to this idea that in this day and age, people today are well and truly aware and indeed shamed. Shame is the word that he uses, to belong to such a collectivity, to belong to a military, because they are aware, in a way that those who celebrate military culture are not, that the military does require this, as he's saying, this sharpness, this contempt for life. I mean, this ability to kill, someone who is an enemy, and dehumanize them in that sense, right? Just reduce someone to a simple enemy, to forget about their humanity, where they've come from, their experiences, what their favorite foods were, what their loves were, what romantic experiences they had. To think of someone as simply an enemy is, of course, to reduce them to a shallow fiction of what they are, right? We just killed them like some other person in uniform for another country's flag. Now that the unconditional duty that he speaks of here, right? So the modern Pacific cosmopolitan industrial mind recognizes and is shameful in its recognition of this unconditional duty, knowing that there's things attached to it sometimes, such as conscription, blood tax. How can one feel honored by belonging to this? I think he's suggesting here, and there's a strong sense in his mind that the military esprit de corps has run onto sort of the rocks, so to speak. I think in this passage, the military esprit de corps is perceived by those in the pleasure economy or those in the Pacific cosmopolitan industrialist economy as being something like a fraud. And in a way, I think what William James is perceiving here is what subsequently people would lament as the Vietnam syndrome. And already he was talking about this before World War I, which is quite interesting. In the final point here, I mean, it's just important to recognize that James, I think, was a socialist, but not just any old socialist. I think, to me, he was... I'm not quite sure what any old socialist would necessarily be, that said, but anyway, I think I detect a sort of a Rousseauian overtone here, and that this is a philosopher who was very much captivated by the sort of conservative notions of the manly virtues. He uses this term several times and he evokes the idea of this campaigning life. And I think one of the things that sort of he seems to respect the poor because they have an intimate experience of this campaigning life, as he seems to reveal on page 70. This campaigning life, of course, is something that those in the pleasure sphere, those in the pleasure economy, never get to experience. But he says on page 70, and I'm interested in this, the war party is assuredly right in affirming and reaffirming that the martial values, although originally gained by the race through war, are absolute and permanent human goods. Patriotic pride and ambition in their military form are, after all, only specifications of a more general competitive passion. They are its first form, but that is no reason for supposing them to be its last form. Men are now proud of belonging to a conquering nation, and without a murmur they lay down their persons and their wealth, if by so doing they may fend off subjection. And so this is very, very important, that we recognize that with the conservatives, and sympathize with their point about basically that hard life seems to, and the experience of a military campaign, for example, the hardship that it comes with it is sort of something that deepens one's subjective ability to perceive truth, ethical truth, to perceive what one is fighting for, to have a moral compass that is weighted with a sense of what is at stake in war, why one is fighting, and the value of peace once one returns home and perceives that peace is such a stark contrast to war. If you've never experienced war, then how do you would take peace for granted, I suppose, is the point. Similarly, then on page 70, he makes it very, very clear that while he is a socialist, and while he does believe that many people have hardship thrust upon them in a way that they don't deserve, the strong Marxist sort of language being used here on page 70 in the second column. But he says, these people have no vacation, while others, natively no more deserving, never get any taste of this campaigning life at all. This is capable of arousing indignation in reflective minds, right? This idea that there are people who are, middle class or upper class, are people who have basic material goods, who are now, because of industrialization and because of the media, sort of spreading types of entertainment which are numbing of the critical mind, you might say, that perhaps it is time to think about how we could sort of artificially create hardship for people, not necessarily through the military, but rather by borrowing on the idea of a military conscription, a conscription of the youth specifically, which is sort of, I guess, an idea that produces in our minds a notion of the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps, a sort of a volunteer army that would go around doing good work, good service for people. And that would be a good antidote to the blindness of the luxurious classes, he suggests. Again, using this language of the hard foundations of man's higher life. So if people had experiences in the Peace Corps or in the AmeriCorps, perhaps they would have an experience of hardness, of difficulty in their lives, and they would once again appreciate the hard foundations of man's higher life. And then later on he says they'd have the childishness knocked out of them, and then they would come back into society, I suppose, much as military men might, with healthier sympathies and sober ideas. And they would have paid their blood tax, done their part in the immemorial human warfare against nature. They would tread the earth more proudly, and the women would value them more highly. They would be better fathers and teachers of the following generation. Of course, I mean, I think, okay, there's maybe some merits to that. Maybe you guys have thoughts about that yourselves. We can talk about it in class. But I think, I think there's a slightly bit of touch of the fantastical there on the part of James myself. I think many people would be highly critical of this idea that it has to be manly virtues, and that the women would appreciate these manly virtues if the men are coming back, because clearly, apparently, women aren't going to be in AmeriCorps for James, or women aren't going to be in Peace Corps from James's perspective. So I think that's deeply problematic. There's a machismo here. There's a sort of a gender bias, I think, that's clearly coming through. And many people would challenge the idea that somehow human life that humans are somehow incapable of knowing the value of their life unless they experience hardship. I mean, are we so sure? It seems to be for James that this goes without saying, but is that necessarily true? I don't know. It's definitely something to think about. I would refer you to a book by David Livingstone is the guy's name. James Livingstone, excuse me. David Livingstone was the explorer. James Livingstone wrote a book called Against Thrift, which addressed some of this kind of question, if you're interested in looking into it further, whether hardship is actually necessary. And interestingly, both on the left and on the right, people seem to think that hardship is necessary. But it's not clear that one has to take that position. A final thing for this slide that just wanted to sort of preemptively talk about the Jeep Whole Again Superbowl ad from the other night. This is the Super Bowl 2013 advert from the USO and Jeep Corporation, which I think just to sort of point it out would be something that James would have a real problem with, because it talks about the people back home anxiously waiting the return of the soldier, and who is the soldier returning as? The soldier is returning as someone who has been made whole again, as this is the title of the advert, through the experience of having left the family, gone off to war, serving with honor and distinction in the unit, and coming back and knowing again the value of the homestead and the freedom that the homestead enjoys, in a democracy at least. But I think James would be very cynical about this. I think he would say that ads like this are sort of precisely a symptom of the problem, and are deserving of the criticism of the so-called industrial mind. because it doesn't reveal anything of the sharpness of the mandate to kill that the soldier has as part of his experience. And what James is trying to do is to sort of suggest that maybe this whole again need not necessarily be untrue or a fiction, but it could actually be made in a much more honest way and mature way through the use of an AmeriCorps or Peace Corps type campaign. So there you go, folks. That's the end of this week's online lecture, and I'll see you in class on Wednesday. Take care.